The clock ticked past midnight. John, weary from his late shift, trudged home. Streetlights cast long, eerie shadows. The night was quiet, save for the echo of his own footsteps. A chill wind whispered through the empty streets. John pulled his jacket tighter, quickening his pace. He just wanted to be home, safe in his apartment. The silence was starting to get to him. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps behind him. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but the street remained empty. As John rounded a corner, he noticed a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. The figure stood motionless, silhouetted against the pale light. It seemed to be facing him even from a distance. John couldn't make out any features, just the vague shape of a man. He hesitated, a shiver running down his spine. Why was someone just standing there at this hour? John told himself it was probably just someone waiting for a ride. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. As John drew closer, he could finally make out the figure's face. The man was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, too wide, and stretched almost ear to ear. His teeth gleamed unnaturally white in the dim light. The man's eyes were fixed on John, an unsettling glint in them. John's breath hitched in his throat. There was something deeply unsettling about the man's smile. It was predatory, hungry. John's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that something was very wrong. John's heart pounded in his chest. He forced himself to look away from the man's unnerving grin, picking up his pace. The night was eerily silent, the only sound being the echo of his own footsteps on the deserted street. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, making everything seem more sinister. John's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Who was this man? Why was he following him? He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, urging him to run, but he knew he had to stay calm and think clearly. He snuck another glance over his shoulder. The man was still there, still smiling, and he was moving. The grin on the man's face was unsettling, almost as if he was enjoying the fear he was instilling in John. The way he moved was strange, almost robotic, as if he was being controlled by some unseen force. John's mind flashed back to the stories he had heard about people being followed by mysterious figures, but he had always dismissed them as urban legends. Now he wasn't so sure. He swayed from side to side, his movements jerky and unnatural, almost like a dance. It was as if he was mocking John, mimicking his every move. John tried to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping up on him, but it was no use. The man's movements were too precise, too deliberate. It was as if he was playing a game, and John was the unwitting participant. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. John's blood ran cold. The man was mimicking him. Every step he took, every turn he made, the man followed suit. It was like looking into a twisted mirror. John's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. He couldn't keep running forever. He had to find a way to lose this man, to break free from this nightmarish game. But how? The streets were empty and there was nowhere to hide. Every time John took a step, the figure swayed. It was as if he were a puppet master, controlling the man's movements from afar. The thought was both terrifying and surreal. John had never believed in the supernatural, but this experience was making him question everything he thought he knew. He could feel the man's eyes on him, watching his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. The pressure was overwhelming, and John knew he had to act fast. It was as if he were a puppet master, controlling the man's movements from afar. The thought was both terrifying and surreal. John had never believed in the supernatural, but this experience was making him question everything he thought he knew. He could feel the man's eyes on him, watching his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. The pressure was overwhelming, and John knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let this man get the better of him. He had to find a way to break free from this nightmarish game. A wave of terror washed over John. He had to get out of there. He took a deep breath and started to run, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty street, and he could hear the man's footsteps following close behind. He didn't dare look back. He just kept running, hoping that he could outrun this nightmare. The street seemed to stretch on forever, and John's legs were starting to feel like lead, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep going. He had to find a way to escape. Section 5. The chase begins. John broke into a run. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear the sound of his own pounding footsteps echoed by another set of footsteps. The smiling man was chasing him. Adrenaline surged through John's veins. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning. The sound of the smiling man's footsteps grew closer. John risked a glance over his shoulder. The man was gaining on him, his smile wider than ever, his eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. John's heart hammered against his ribs. He had to get away. Section 6. A desperate sprint. John's legs screamed for respite, but he couldn't stop. The sound of the smiling man's heavy breathing filled the air behind him, spurring him on. He could almost feel the man's presence closing in on him. John's vision blurred, his chest constricted with fear. He spotted an alleyway up ahead, a narrow dark chasm between two buildings. It wasn't much, but it was his only chance. John veered off the sidewalk, his shoes skidding on the pavement as he desperately hoped the alley wasn't a dead end. Section 7. A narrow escape. The alley was narrow, reeking of garbage and urine. The dim light from a flickering street lamp barely illuminated the path ahead, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The air was thick with the stench of decay, making it hard to breathe. John's footsteps echoed loudly, each step a reminder of the danger that lurked behind him. John didn't care. He sprinted through the darkness, his heart pounding in his ears. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to stop, but he pushed on, driven by sheer adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was putting as much distance as possible between himself and the smiling man. He could hear the smiling man's frustrated growl as he reached the entrance of the alley. The sound sent a shiver down John's spine, but he didn't dare look back. He knew that one moment of hesitation could be his last. The smiling man was relentless, a predator who thrived on fear and desperation. John had seen the look in his eyes, a cold, calculating gaze that promised pain and suffering. John didn't slow down, not even when he stumbled over a loose piece of rubble. He caught himself just in time, his hands scraping against the rough pavement. Pain shot through his palms, but he ignored it. There was no time to dwell on the pain. He had to keep moving. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending maze of darkness and danger. He burst out of the other end of the alley, gasping for breath. The sudden change in scenery was disorienting, but he didn't stop. He could still hear the smiling man's footsteps echoing in the distance, a haunting reminder that he wasn't safe yet. The city streets were deserted, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an eerie silence. John's lungs burned, but he forced himself to keep running. John didn't stop running until he reached the relative safety of his apartment building. The familiar sight of the old brick facade brought a small measure of comfort, but he knew he wasn't out of danger yet. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the smiling man emerging from the shadows. The street was empty, but John's paranoia wouldn't let him relax. He had to get inside, where he could lock the door and catch his breath. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the lock. Each second felt like an eternity as he struggled to steady his trembling fingers. Finally, the key slid into place and he turned it with a sense of urgency. The door creaked open and John slipped inside, slamming it shut behind him. He leaned against the door, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. For now he was safe, but the memory of the smiling man's cold eyes would haunt him for a long time. Section 8. A warning whispered. Safe inside his apartment, John leaned against the door, his chest heaving. He slowly slid down to the floor, his back against the cool wood. He sat there for a long time, just trying to catch his breath. The events of the night replayed in his mind, the smiling man's face seared into his memory. John knew he had been incredibly lucky to escape. He shuddered to think what might have happened if he hadn't outrun the smiling man. He had a feeling that the encounter was far from over. Section 9. The smiling man remains. The next day, John considered going to the police, but what would he say? He replayed the events of the previous night over and over in his mind, trying to make sense of it. The eerie smile, the relentless pursuit, the feeling of dread that had settled in his bones. It all seemed so surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. That a man with a creepy smile had chased him through the streets? He imagined the look on the officer's face, the skepticism in their eyes. They would probably laugh it off, dismiss it as a figment of his imagination. But John knew what he had seen. He could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, the terror that had gripped him as he ran for his life. They would think he was crazy, so he kept it to himself. The memory of that night a chilling secret. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smiling man's face, that unnerving grin etched into his mind. It was as if the man had imprinted himself onto John's very soul, a haunting presence that refused to be forgotten. But John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a pair of eyes. Every rustle of leaves a whisper of his name. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his heart racing at the slightest sound. The paranoia was consuming him, turning his once peaceful life into a living nightmare. He saw the smiling man everywhere he went, lurking in the shadows, his grin a constant threat. It was as if the man had become a part of the darkness, an inescapable spectre that haunted his every step. John tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, that the smiling man wasn't real. But deep down, he knew the truth, and he knew, deep down, that he would see him again. The thought sent chills down his spine, but there was a strange sense of inevitability about it. The smiling man was out there, waiting. John could feel it in his bones, a cold certainty that he couldn't escape. He didn't know when or where, but he knew that their paths would cross again. The smiling man was out there, waiting, and John knew that when the time came, he would have to face him. There was no running away, no hiding from the inevitable. The smiling man had marked him, and there was no escaping his fate. As John walked the empty streets at night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread, knowing that the smiling man was always just a step behind, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.